live here, but the YouTube fucked it up. We're don't get a drink or whatever. I'll do the short remarks and let's go. Let's talk after the talk.
Smallest cannon that I've ever seen. That understands the district too.
So we're gonna do this thing. All right, everybody, we're gonna get this thing started. So take your seats, grab a chair. We should be live on YouTube now. We had a brief technical delay. YouTube streaming is not my area of yeah, sure. YouTube streaming not my area of expertise, so you'll have to excuse me there. There we go. So yeah, I hate to stand in front of you here. Everybody, so good morning. My name is Blair. Afternoon at this point. My name is Blair Rees. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Carolina Forward. We are a policy organization that communicates and promotes the ideas, the values, the policies of North Carolina center-left. We feel sometimes like that's kind of a lonely area of the political spectrum, where it sometimes feels like, anyone no matter which side kind of you're on, right? Like 1 degree to one side of me is an extremist, and 1 degree to the other side of me is a traitor, right? Well, that doesn't really reflect real life, right? Because we just saw in this election, we had a very close election we just went through. Democrats very disappointed they couldn't convert a U.S. Senate seat, even though it was very, very close with Ted Budd and Sherry Beasley. We did not choose Beasley's necessarily for that reason, but we also did not choose it for that reason. Republicans very disappointed as well. They couldn't convert a legislative supermajority, even if it was by 1 vote, after 2 years of telling us it's going to be a slam dunk. Couldn't do it, mostly because of one of the Carolina Forward's endorsed candidates, Diamond Stanton Williams, God bless her. So today, we want to talk a little bit about what this election was, what happened, kind of what it means for North Carolina. For that, we invited a couple of the smartest political people in North Carolina, all of them much smarter than myself. I'm going to let our moderator here, Justin, do the introductions. Policy fellow at Carolina Forward, a good friend, and way smarter than most people who I see in writing about North Carolina politics on the internet. Justin King, why don't you introduce our panel over here? Oh, sorry. One quick thing. Quick housekeeping tip. This ain't church, so the spirit moves you. Get you something to eat, drink, whatever that it happens to be, and that's fine. We'll do this for about an hour. And then we'll break, get something to eat, mingle, questions, and so forth. So with that, here, try this again.
Thank you, Blair. Good afternoon to everyone. When Blair first approached me about doing this, I was a little nervous at the turnout we would possibly have, being the week between the election and Thanksgiving, because most of the time you kind of turn the page on the election and you want to move on and do something else, and we got Thanksgiving coming up. So we were just blown away by the level of interest, you guys showing up here, and of course those of you watching at home. So I know all of you here to hear our great panelists, and without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone. So to my far left down here, she is a guru of rural organizing who currently works as a rural broadband analyst and currently serves as the county chair for the Democratic Party in Person County. Please welcome Anderson Clayton. So to my immediate left, he is the person with the longest commute here today. He's actually closer to the Georgia Senate runoff than he is to Raleigh. So we appreciate him coming. He's a Madison Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs and Director of the Public Policy Institute at Western Carolina University. Please welcome Dr. Chris Cooper. To my immediate right is a practicing attorney here in Raleigh who previously served as the chair of the Wake County Board of Commissioners and was the Democratic nominee for Labor Commissioner in 2020. Please welcome Jessica Holmes. And last but certainly not least, the individual has been at this for over a quarter of a century, having held key positions in statewide races and served as an advisor to former governors Easley and Perdue. He currently serves as a professor of the public practice within the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Please welcome Mac McCorkle. And as Blair said, my name is Justin King. I am a business owner here in Raleigh. I live in Johnston County. In 2020, I was a candidate, a local candidate in Johnston County. So I bring that to the table of having run a uncompetitive race and, giving it all you got. So I'm hoping to share some of my insight with you as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. All right. I can get my paper to work here with me. So a couple months ago, Blair and I were having a text back and forth. This was after the Dobbs decision came out. And we started seeing this polling really moving towards Democrats. And there was a poll in Ohio that had Tim Ryan up like double digits. And Blair texted me, he said, "Am I allowed to have hope for Ohio?" And I said, "Sure, this is just going to be a weird election." So Blair takes a screenshot of that and posted on Twitter about the weird election thing, and people liked it, and it, went viral, whatever, not viral, but you know what I mean. And I come back to it after last Tuesday. I still come back to it being a weird election. And so I go to Politico yesterday to read what they had to say, and there on the homepage is a quote from a sitting Republican member of Congress saying, "This is the weirdest election I've ever been involved in." So apparently I was on to something 2 months ago because it went against the historical trends of what we typically see. And so for that, to try and get an analysis of what should have happened, we're going to turn that over to Dr. Cooper.
So my question is, what should have happened?
I'm sorry. Explain how a typical midterm is supposed to kind of play out.
Yes, similar in some ways, different in others. No. Look, we expect, of course, the party of the president to lose seats in the midterm. Everybody knows this now, right? The idea is, political scientists talk about this as sort of thermostatic public opinion, right? Just like a thermostat gets too hot, all of a sudden it comes on, gets colder. Same thing, we move a little red, and then it's too far, so we come back blue, and vice versa, blue to red. So that's what we expected to see. In some ways we did. Like, I don't think either party should be ecstatic with the results that they saw. I think we saw a lot of variation across the country. I think we saw variation across the country for a few reasons. One is that the effects of abortion were felt differently in different places. So, for example, in a place like Ohio or a place like Texas, the Democratic messaging could very much be, look what happened. If you don't want that to happen anymore, vote with our party. I think that's a tougher sell, frankly, in a state like North Carolina, where the messaging has to be, we pinky swear that we're reading the tea leaves correctly, and if you vote for this other party, then this thing will change sometime in the future. I think that's tough, and I think we saw that. I certainly saw that in the mailers that I got in my mailbox, and I think that may describe one reason why some of the Democrats underperformed in North Carolina. I think we also saw in other states some some terrifically bad Republican candidates. I mean, Dr. Oz, love him or hate him, and in this group, I'm assuming that is hate him. He was not a good candidate by any of the traditional metrics. Herschel Walker, not a good candidate by any traditional metrics. So I think you kind of put all that together, and then you bring us back to North Carolina, a state that I would still argue is a purple state, in a year that's good at the margins for Republicans, and then you see the Republican candidate in a mostly mistake-free election for both sides, winning by about 3.5 percentage points. That feels about right to me in terms of what I would expect, right? Republican wins to their back, Republican winning, but not by a huge margin. Ted Budd, I'm guessing in this room, not your favorite candidate, but also not a bad candidate, right? I mean, the guy served in Congress. There was no major scandal. There was no October surprise. He ran a quiet campaign, which is what I think he needed to do. So I think you put all that together, and that's kind of what you see here.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. So 8% inflation rate, 7% mortgages, 30-year mortgage rate. We had almost $5 gasoline back last spring. It just didn't seem to really, at the end of the day, I don't think that really mattered as much as a lot of people thought it would. Certainly the polling was very good in North Carolina. In fact, we have an article coming out on Monday about that. It was actually very good in this state. I think the polling trends in some of the other battleground states really sort of pushed a narrative that maybe wasn't there. And so that's how you ended up, even despite North Carolina, where we were, that was still the fourth closest Senate race of all the ones that were ran. So we've now 2 cycles in a row. We had the fourth closest presidential race, now the fourth closest Senate race, 2 straight cycles. So it's like it just doesn't, at the end of the day, if both sides are turning out, at close to record numbers, it's hard for one party or the other to really break away with this thing. So that's what we're going to talk about next is turnout. There were some real winners on turnout, and there were some real big misses on the Democratic side. So one of the big winners was Wake County. So I actually have a Wake County expert here to discuss that with you. Jessica, if you'd like to talk about the turnout in Wake County.
I wouldn't necessarily call myself an expert. I would probably defer that to people like Maggie and Kimberly over here in terms of their expertise. But Blair started with mentioning that this is not church. Well, I think there's a spiritual element to politics, so if you all want to amen something that I say, you are more than welcome to do that. I will also, in talking about turnout, one of my primary concerns right now is the reality that we're not turning out people that historically haven't already turned out. So at some point, if we're going to increase turnout, we've got to stop just preaching to the choir. So he mentioned sort of hit or miss, and most people in referring to hit or miss right now in terms of turnout are referring to Wake County and Mecklenburg. That said, Wake County ended up at about 55%, just under 55% voter turnout, which is a lot. Like, kudos to Wake County, for doing that. That said, Mecklenburg is considered to be a miss because they turned out about 44%. And when you're talking about the 2 most populous counties in all of North Carolina, it makes a huge difference when we're talking about, for example, that U.S. Senate race. So to talk a little bit about the specifics out of Wake County, for example, one of my favorite highlights is the re-election in a very tight race of Sidney Batch, Senator Sidney Batch. And I want to note that Sidney's in NC Senate 17. Another race that, on the Senate side, that is important to mention is Mary Wills Bodie. She also won in NC Senate 18. So on the Senate side in Wake County, Dems won every single Senate seat, including the 2 most competitive seats. Really, among the 2 most competitive seats across the state were right here in Wake County in terms of the Senate. And also in terms of the House in Wake County cleaned up everything except 1 seat. And that's a seat that was that had incumbent Aaron Pear in it. So I also want to note countywide that there's a new sheriff in town in Wake County. Sheriff Willie Rowe, who is not a stranger to many of us in this room. Wake County cleaned up every at-large seat in Wake County went to Democrats. So every county commissioner seat, the sheriff's seat, the district attorney, Lauren Freeman, all went Democratic. That said, we did, when it comes to our school board, we have a 9-member school board. Prior to the election, it was comprised of 8 Democrats and 1 Republican. After the election, Democrats lost the seat, and the Wake County School Board is now 7 Democrats to 2 Republicans. So we still maintain a majority on the Wake County School Board. That said, lots to be proud about, but going back to the mess that is Mecklenburg right now, I want to highlight a particular race, a judicial race. We all know how important our judicial races is. You can't talk about social justice without talking about your DA, without talking about your sheriff, without talking about your judges. We had an incumbent, and I'll just, as a disclaimer, we know our judicial races used to be nonpartisan, arguably should still be nonpartisan. But that said, incumbent Democrat Kimberly Best in Mecklenburg County, an amazing judge, a woman who is also a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority like myself, like the vice president of this country. She has lost her race, her judicial race, by about 70 votes. 70 votes in a county like Mecklenburg with over 1 million residents. Now, I'm going to pick on them a little bit more, but I want to give some folks an opportunity to join in as well. But I also want to share my honorable mention county. Typically, we like to pick on Eastern North Carolina. I'm born and raised in Pender County. And, we talk about Eastern North Carolina in terms of lower turnout. Well, I want to give a shout out to Pamlico County for having just over 60% turnout, about 62%. And I also want to also then pick on Onslow County, which borders the county I grew up in, for only having 30-something% turnout. So again, I think when it comes to turnout for either party, yes, roughly 50% of registered voters turned out. And yes, that is more or less in line with historical numbers. However, again, when you look at voters that are new voters, in particular, we got to do something better when it comes to both parties, when it comes to engaging and getting new voters who aren't traditional voters out to the polls.
Thank you, Jessica. And just to give a little more context on Mecklenburg, she mentioned the 1 judicial race. So basically what happened is in Mecklenburg, we also had a very competitive state house race in northern Mecklenburg, Cornelius-Davidson area. If Mecklenburg had just voted at the statewide turnout, which was around 50%, Beasley, I did the math on this, she got 65% of the vote in Mecklenburg. She would have bagged an extra 29,000 votes. If Meck would have voted at the same level as Wake, Beasley would have gotten 50,000 more votes just in one county. We would have won that state house race. So you think about it, if we would have had 2 seats to work with now instead of just 1, I mean, that's where your turnout really matters. Judicial race is very important. But gosh, that veto override, holding that veto will look a lot better today had we not lost that House seat by 661 votes, which I feel comfortable in saying we would have won had they just voted at the statewide turnout. So enough pounding on Mecklenburg. There's other people to pound on. So for that, I'm going to jump over here to Mac, who's our guru on what he refers to as the countrypolitan area of North Carolina, which is where I reside, which is the exurban, hybrid, rural/growing areas outside the major metros. So, Mac, what did you see in the countrypolitan as far as turnout?
Well, let me first say that, unfortunately, my history goes back more than a quarter century, unfortunately. Goes back to my first race here was in 1984, and I was doing research for Jim Hunt, the Jim Hunt campaign on Jesse Helms. So I've been around for a while. I want to use that because I do think there's a structural problem, and I call it the countrypolitan problem. But I want to say that compared to a lot of Southern parties, there has been this transformation in the Democratic Party over a long period of time from a Jim Crow Democratic Party to a modern, I think, progressive, especially for the South, party. And that has been a situation that did not necessarily need to happen. So I don't think we need to get in a circular firing squad, and I don't mean to start one by saying there's a problem, because I think we've gotten close. And in good years, like 2008, we won the Senate race and the presidential race here, so don't forget that. But the problem is when things are not so good nationally, what the problem is. And what I refer to as the countrypolitan problem is, while we have done really well in Wake and Mecklenburg, and can still do well in Wake and Mecklenburg because of the city vote in Raleigh and Charlotte especially. And you go through basically the top 10 towns, cities in North Carolina, 90,000 above, from Greenville to Asheville on up. That's Democratic strongholds, and we win those counties usually, and that's strong. And we know that non-metropolitan or rural, small town North Carolina, among white voters at least, is a strong Republican area. But I talk about 28 counties that are on the fringe of the big city counties. Johnston is an example, Union is an example, right outside of Guilford. You can think of those counties. And those are areas where you would think Democrats would be getting closer. And we are in places, well, we are. I'm on lunchtime, I'm a professor, so I'll say we, but in Cabarrus County, right next to Mecklenburg, the Democratic margins, Democrats are getting way more competitive there. The margin is not 20 or 30%. So maybe that's the canary in the coal mine saying that ultimately North Carolina will turn more durably Democratic. I've been saying that since I was Harvey Gantt's campaign manager, deputy campaign manager in 1990. I'm on record. You can read an article where I said we're just on the cusp, and we're still just on the cusp. So, but the problem is those countrypolitan areas, and it is one way to talk about them is to say that we need better turnout, which is certainly correct. You always want better turnout, but I think that the problem in the countrypolitan areas is we really have not laid roots as a democratic political culture in those counties. So certain people are quixotic and loyal candidates who run in Johnston County, but we're still losing, Democrats are still losing over 20 or 30 points in a Johnston County, despite it being a growing county and new people moving there. So one of the things I emphasize is beyond the traditional notion of turnout, is I think Democrats need to be thinking about not just the votes in countrypolitan areas, but finding new leaders there. And we have these outposts in these areas. Monroe, North Carolina, until 2021, didn't have a Republican on the city council. There's a Democratic mayor in Hendersonville. There's Democratic mayors in Reidsville. Outside the countrypolitan, there's a Democratic mayor in Beaufort, North Carolina. There's a Democratic mayor, I think, in Anderson's Way, too. And thanks to Anderson's efforts, and I'll let her speak in just a second. So rather than just thinking about votes, election time, kind of rounding up our votes, Democrats need to think about building political cultures where not just win city council races, might win county commission races, might be more competitive. And where this is not just as a matter of winning statewide races, but having a strategy for legislative races as well. Our vote, Democratic vote, is way too concentrated right now, and Democrats overwin in certain places. We need, Democrats can increase the turnout there, but that's not all the problem, and I feel like we still keep on getting close. We've got to expand the range, or otherwise we will remain sitting ducks for gerrymandering, because it's so easy to gerrymander a party that has the vote in an over-concentrated way.
Thank you, Mac. And I'll just say, from my standpoint in Johnston, we really stood tall this election, despite Republicans having a really good night, especially in eastern North Carolina. Beasley got right back to Biden's percentage in 2020, and actually Wiley Nickel jumped over Beasley. He ran about almost 2 points ahead. That won him that congressional seat. He outperformed Bo Hines. So I was tickled because we had Ted Cruz on this big Golden Tiger tour bus, literally like in my backyard a couple weeks ago, dragging around Bo Hines and Ted Budd. So to say we stood tall, Republicans really didn't turn out to vote like I thought they would. So we actually had a pretty good election. Gives me a lot of hope for 2024. So now to the bad part. So let's talk about the rural areas. That's where what has totally collapsed for Democrats in North Carolina. And so I've got an expert here on that. Anderson, can you walk us through what happened on the election with the rural counties?
I can try, but my gosh, he's making us sound terrible over here. Which I think that there were some definite downsides, right, in rural areas on election night, and we felt that really strongly. I'm a Democratic Party chair in Person County, so I was listening to Attorney Holmes talk about all their wins in Wake, and y'all could see myself sitting here going, wow, like wins on school board, county commission, everything all down the line, and I'm like, I got wiped on Tuesday in a way that was not so fun, but also something that I did not expect. We had, in 2021, when I became chair of the Person County Democratic Party, we flipped our Roxborough City Council. We have 3 Democrats that now sit on that city council. They are black Democrats in our community, people that were business owners, people that were just strong leaders in the community, but also one woman in particular who works at McDonald's. Her name is Shayna Outlaw, and she now sits on the Roxborough City Council. Yeah. And all of that was because we got 600 people in Roxborough City Council to turn out to vote. We had 51% of the city of Roxborough was black. Those were voters that the county party there had never tapped into, never gotten involved with, and never really pushed out to vote. And in my opinion, that's where when Matt comes in and talks about countrypolitan areas and areas that we could be winning election cycles, I think year after year, especially in our local races, are coming down to the wire when it comes to our rural areas that we're overlooking simply because we think they're unwinnable. Or in 2016, they got labeled Trump country, right? And we said we don't want to touch those areas with a 10-foot pole. And I get that. I do. I still talk to those people every day. We took those 2021 wins and we turned around and we said, okay, we got 2 county commissioner races coming up this next year, a sheriff's race, and we got Ray Jeffers, who's hopefully going into our state house, which he did. That was a win for us to protect Roy Cooper's veto on election night. What I will say, though, we had an extreme loss in our county commissioner races, also with my sheriff's race, but we had higher black turnout in the city of Roxborough than we saw in 2018 in a previous midterm election, which is something I'm really excited about. It's something that I think that we're going to carry forward in the next year and keep turning out those voters. The thing that I didn't see, though, is my unaffiliated voters did not turn out in the way that I thought they would, and also unregistered voters, right, that we were not able to target. I had people coming to me that honestly I graduated with, which is the ticker for me in this election cycle. 6 people texted me on election day and said, Anderson, can I register to vote today? Those are people my age, right? And I'm thinking that when we're talking about young folks in this election cycle, and where we did have a miss is like getting out folks that were unregistered, hitting those people and touching them in some form or fashion. And for me, especially in rural areas, we undercount those communities the most. Community colleges are a place that we never think to organize on, and I'm like, those are people that live in their own communities, that are going to school there, that have an ability to get involved there in a way that, you know, folks that are going to places like where I graduated from, Appalachian State, right? Like, I was a transplant in that community for 4 years. And even though I got really involved there, it was still something that I'm like, we have opportunities that we're missing out on when engaging young people in rural communities also. I was really sad to see Ricky Hurtado lose by such a slim margin, about 400 and some votes. I'm thinking you're looking at Linda Cooper-Suggs, James Gaillard, Brian Farkas was another big loss for us, and those were because of rural margins, in my opinion. I think that we didn't get out the vote in rural precincts where we didn't have a Democratic arm in those communities. The Person County Democratic Party, when I got back, we had 8 Democrats that would get on a county call. I wish y'all could have seen my poll workers on Tuesday, y'all. Like, they were out everywhere. We had all 11 precincts covered. Election day, I sat there and I said, y'all, we got to hold back. I said, I kind of feel like we're electioneering a little too much to people that are coming up the polls. But it was amazing that me being a rural county was having to tell my poll workers that I had so many people out there with me. And I felt this surge of like resiliency from rural voters that are like, we do want to do this, and we're going to do this again. And even on Tuesday, when we had such hard losses, I've had more people come back up to me and say, Anderson, if the only thing that we ever do in these places is make Republicans actually run for office here, we're doing our jobs. That's what I want every single Democrat across a rural county to feel like and feel empowered to do. I tell people all the time, I'm like, there's a difference in reaching rural Democrats and like reaching rural voters to some degree. I think we need to start with rural Democrats again. Like, let's reach our own base in these communities that are not getting out to vote, that feel disenfranchised, that feel like their voices don't matter anymore in this fight, because they do, and they belong here. That's my long-winded spiel, y'all. I'm sorry about it, but thank you.
Thank you, Anderson. And I can certainly echo that. When I showed up to run in 2020, at the end of 2019, I met with the local party chair, and I showed up to a county meeting, and literally, like, we could have gotten the phone booth and had the meeting. Like, we had like 5 people. And so I left out there and I said, I'm basically going to have to create a party, like, to run on. it's not just going to be with Democrats. Like, I'm going to have to bring in some independents and some Republicans if I'm going to make this thing even somewhat competitive. So, and unfortunately, that's just kind of the scenario you run into in most of North Carolina outside the urban counties, is the county parties have basically fallen apart. So that's really got to be top of mind for whatever's going to come out of the state headquarters here pretty soon. So now we've talked about turnouts. So let's talk about the marquee race, which was the U.S. Senate race. We all know how it turned out. But I did want to get some thoughts from our panelists up here. The big thing that the media made a huge deal about the last month on the Beasley race was how little or how much she was going to involve the Biden administration or President Obama to some extent. We had a big debate internally at Carolina Forward about that, about, should she be seen with Biden? Should she be seen with Harris? Should she call in Obama? Should she call in more surrogates? And at the end, I think they had Cory Booker come and John Ossoff, who I don't think could get ID'd at a Walmart outside of Atlanta, and like Dave Matthews. So they totally ran away from involving any of basically the federal party structure. So what I want to ask Mac is, since he was on the Harvey Gantt campaign, if he were in the Beasley's camp, would have he called the White House and asked for some help, or one of the Obamas, or anyone to come and help out?
I've been on this drill on kind of both sides, and I gather Sherry Beasley would have probably loved to have had President Obama at the end. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But rather than get into that, I think the point is that Sherry Beasley was by far a good enough candidate that she should have been able to win, regardless of any tactical decision about whether Obama comes in late. I think that misses the larger point. And the larger point that, again, I want to keep focusing on is the structural problem about Democratic vote, and how Democrats, even before the election, need to have things in place so that we are not depending on some kind of bailout at the end. These things get very complicated about whether you want national Democrats in or not. So I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time. And I wanted to say, with Anderson's counties, I think of Person and Granville, I actually consider those countrypolitan, because they are connected now in some ways with Durham. And you could say, demographically, they're just going to change in another 30 years. Well, that's what I've been waiting for a long time for. And so it's really important what Anderson is saying about building up a local political culture in those counties, and I think that that's available. So I wanted to say that I think we're on the same page about that. And I'm going to dodge the Biden question.
Typical consultant there. He wants to be right all the time. I'm going to say, personally, I think she should have asked for help from Biden. He campaigned in Pennsylvania. That worked out pretty good. Fetterman, that race wasn't even close. He won by close to 5 points. People weren't scared of him. The guy got 49% of the vote here 2 years ago. I know his numbers were bad, but he's still the president. I mean, even the vice president, I would have taken help from anyone, because we have polling. They have polling. They were seeing the same thing we were, which she was just stuck at 45. And that's pretty much where she ended up in the end. And so if Obama could have come in and gave her a little nudge, I don't know if that would have helped at the end of the day, but oh well, we can cry about that another day. I want to talk to Jessica about Beasley. There was a lot of ink spilled back when this was like a primary between her and Jeff Jackson about, could Jeff win the primary because Beasley was automatically going to get most of the African American support in the primary. So did she mobilize? Your critique of how she campaigned among African Americans, can you shed some light on that?
Well, for starters, I would not use the word critique. Let me start by saying that, I'd bet a paycheck on this. I believe Beasley is the most qualified candidate to ever run for U.S. Senate out of the state of North Carolina. I would put her resume up against anybody that is currently serving in the Senate. And so, one, I want to address the fact that, yes, Beasley, as a black woman, and the assumptions that come with that running statewide, the assumption that a a person of color candidate is expected to then bring out the black vote. Let me address that assumption by saying that just because a candidate is a woman, or just because a candidate is black, or just because a candidate is different, one, does not mean that they are going to magically GOTV that population. Two, nor does it mean that they should be solely responsible for bringing out that particular demographic as well. There are a lot of power players, a lot of parties that be, and there's a party that should also be responsible and held accountable for turnout amongst all demographics. So I'll start there. So I also just want to go back to addressing what was perceived by some as a lack of support at the national level for Beasley. I think that cuts two ways. On the one hand, I think there was a strategic decision on behalf of her campaign to distance the campaign from Biden. You got to think about it. At the time that decision was made, his numbers were in complete free fall. So this wasn't a decision that was made on November 8th. This was a decision that was made months ago. And so at that time, that was the strategic decision that she and her team made. And that's a decision that we have to live with. But as it goes to turnout, as I mentioned before, whether it's whoever's at the top of the ticket, we still got to do a better job of speaking to people that just don't turn out. I think the biggest issue was just voter apathy. Outside of my inner circle, we were in group chats, we were ringing the alarm, we were just like stalking people on Twitter, we were just obsessively paying attention to this election. And I call home to Pender County and I'm like, did y'all vote? And they're like, when is it? So aside from a sprinkle of seeing, campaign signs, which some of them saw as just litter, many people didn't even realize that there was an election, let alone the urgency of the election. So I want to go back to picking on my two urban counties. So when you run the numbers, Beasley lost by roughly 131,000 votes. Say that back to me, 131,000 votes. I want y'all to remember that, because when we talk about Mecklenburg County having turnout at about 45%, Mecklenburg County by itself left 439,000 votes on the table. Beasley lost by 131,000 votes. Mecklenburg County by itself left over 400,000 votes on the table. And again, when you're talking about Wake and Mecklenburg County, you're talking about, quite frankly, Democratic strongholds. And while we said that, Wake County was a hit, I'm gonna also get on Wake County, because we also, although we were above around 55%, we also left on the table 367,000 votes. So we often talk about strategy. We all know that it's very difficult for one candidate to effectively get to all 100 counties. It's a big state. That said, we talk about the strategy of, yes, Democrats absolutely must do better in rural North Carolina. That said, we also can't get complacent in our urban counties either. Because in two counties that are Democratic strongholds, could have made the difference for Beasley, not once, but now twice. So the number that haunted us in 2020 was what, 407 votes? 401 votes. A few must have came in since I checked. 401 votes in 2020. And now the number that will haunt us is 131,000 votes. And Wake and Mecklenburg could have absolutely accounted for those votes in just those two counties. So again, the strategy, as far as I'm concerned, in getting these folks out, we just have to rip the Band-Aid off. We got to start all the way over. We got to, one, get our own base out, because we're not doing that if Democrats only turned out to the tune of 33% statewide. And we're not doing that if the urbans that we count on for our statewide races are turning out at 45, 50%. It's just not going to be good enough. And we keep talking about North Carolina being a battleground state. There won't be many battles if Democrats keep leaving votes at the table the way that we're doing right now.
Thank you, Jessica. Absolutely. Margins matter. Well, Blair and I talk about this all the time. Like, we've got to run up the score in the Big Five. We got to run up the score in the countrypolitan. We got to run up the score, but close the margins. Like, that's how we win statewide. That's the path for us to win the next 20 years. We're not going to win back Pamlico County. We're not going to win Jones County. We're not going to win Avery County. But if we can get 40% in Union, Gaston, Johnston, and get 65 to 67% in Wakeland, Mecklenburg, we're going to win a lot of statewide races. So that's what we have to keep in mind. And Beasley ran a great race. Like, she grew on me as a candidate from the time that the primary basically ended, and she went around. I saw her more, like 10 times more than I ever saw Cal Cunningham. So my critique is definitely not of her. She was an outstanding candidate. There was, unfortunately, some national trends that kind of played into her getting some help. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cooper to sort of explain why maybe on the pecking order this race just wasn't in the top four.
I mean, I'm certainly no Democratic consultant or strategist. Hand back to Mac, and then he can punt on it again. But I mean, but look, I mean, my sense is that they made, well, one thing I think the National Democratic Party overread wins and losses, and that may sound a little strange, right? But I think North Carolina has been just on the other side of the knife's edge on so many elections. And so I think the national party tends to look at that and see a series of losses. And I think what they should have seen from that is a series of close races, right? So if we think about the last I can hand her Jess when we do the church thing again. I'm a professor, I'm not allowed to, but she can get the church thing going again, get the yeses. But in 2016, right, we were the reddest, or the bluest red state in the country. Georgia was the bluest red state in the country, right? In other words, well, I said that backwards. Sorry. North Carolina was the sort of the bluest of all the red. Georgia was the reddest of all the blue. But I think the national media environment read that as Georgia flipped, North Carolina didn't. But I don't think they paid nearly enough attention to the fact that Georgia and North Carolina were closer to each other than Georgia was to the next bluest state or North Carolina was to the next reddest state. So if anything qualifies as purple, it is the state of North Carolina. Now, you may just argue there is no purple left, and that's a fair and kind of fun argument. But if it exists, then it exists here, and I think it still exists in Georgia. As to why they made it, so I think they overread wins and losses. I also think they made a strategic decision to invest first in defense before offense, which makes sense, right? They want to hold on to the majority. I get why they did that, but I think ultimately it was certainly not to the long-term benefit of the Democratic Party here in the state of North Carolina. Whether it's to the betterment of democracy, I guess I'll leave that for other folks to decide.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. So what I want to say is, yes, Beasley lost, but her running and doing what she did really helped us get these congressional candidates over the line. Very similar to what Tim Ryan did in Ohio. The media wanted to sort of link those two together, like the bubble seats, like the team that wants to get in the NCAA tournament, but they're the bubble team. They're like the 66 team or whatever. It's like they never could get the investment, but they were very critical. Both of them running the campaigns they did helped push Don Davis over to Congress, helped push Wiley Nickel over. Like, we had the best GOTV we've ever had in Johnston County because we had a competitive congressional race and because the Beasley people invested money. It's like we had more poll workers than we ever had before. We had more sign putter outers. I mean, we've had way more volunteers this past time because we had good candidates at the top on the federal races. So just because she didn't win her race, she really helped down ballot in places like Wake County, where we had state legislative races, where we won because we had good candidates. So for that, I'm going to turn it over back to Jessica. In terms of Wake County, like, you guys seem to have all the good candidates there. Like, you just go, there's like a candidate factory in Wake County. Like, how do you guys get these candidates? Because we struggle everywhere. Anderson will tell you, we struggle to get people to run for anything, but you guys just seem to have them like lined up.
Well, for starters, I will credit, I feel like we have a very strong sort of set of what I'd call sort of experts, so to speak, or people that are really good mentors. So, for example, I think Wake County is very proactive in terms of recruiting and identifying younger talent and just talent in general. I think Wake County is very intentional about ensuring diversity, diversity in terms of age. For example, when I ran in 2014, I was recruited. I was somewhere minding my business. It took about 3 months for me to say yes, as it does for many women. Women have to be oftentimes asked multiple times. Usually the golden number is 7. So I feel in Wake County in particular that we have a set of leaders who are very much invested in the outcomes of our races and are very intentional about recruiting and identifying talent. And getting people to run and providing the support they need in order to run. And so, like I said, I mentioned Maggie Barlow earlier, but she's one of those people that helped talk me into running in 2014. And at the time, when I ran, I became the youngest person ever elected in Wake County's history to ever serve on the county commission, then went on to become the youngest person ever to serve as chair of that board. So I think people just have to be intentional about identifying people and not just waiting for people to raise their hand. Because quite frankly, my personal experience is the people that raise their hand, oftentimes are the people who call me and say, Jessica, I want to run. And I'm like, for what? They don't even know what seat they want to run for. And then I'm like, well, what are your priorities? And they don't have much of anything to say. So I find that identifying people that are already involved in, for example, I was recruited because I was an attorney at NCAE. I was very much involved in education. I was very active around social justice issues. So I think finding people that are inherently passionate about the work and aren't just necessarily following party talking points, but people in the community who are actually doing the work. And I think that comes across as more genuine and more authentic when it comes to getting people to actually turn out. And the other thing I'll mention, it was referenced earlier, Ricky Hurtado, which is the first Hispanic to ever serve in the General Assembly, lost his seat barely. But I also want to go back and highlight 2 particular wins in Wake County. Ya Lu, who was Cary Town Council. She was the first woman of color to ever serve on the Cary Town Council and is now the first Asian American woman to serve in the General Assembly, and she's out of Wake County. Also, we have Maria Cervania, who's the first Filipino woman to serve on the Wake Board of Commissioners, and now she's also serving her first term, or about to serve her first term in the North Carolina House. So I do think that, while I mentioned earlier, I don't think diversity in itself is a reason for someone to turn out to vote, but we have really competent, qualified people who represent and who look like the people that they are going to serve, and I do think that makes a difference.
Thank you, Jessica. So, yeah, in Wake County, it's really competitive. Those 2 Senate races and the state House race with Terrence Everett, we had better candidates on the field. I mean, they were trying to put E.C. Sykes and turn that into something, and that was, that's a hot mess. Even the consultants on their side gave up with that. I mean, there was no way to spin that. So we're very fortunate for what they're doing in Wake, because the candidates we had won those races. The work they put in, the doors they knocked, the volunteers that showed up for them, like people, you could tell people were excited to support those candidates. So when you're out looking for candidates to run, like Jessica said, is it the person that raises their hand that volunteers to run every time, or is it the person that, hey, can you...
doing the work in the community already anyway.
Right, that you can have a talk with them and say, this person, I think he or she can excite, our voters and get them to the polls, because those margins matter. So as far as the legislature goes, I want to ask Mac, did anything surprise you with the legislative races, how the margins came out in terms of number of seats? I mean, did anything shock you by what? I mean, you and I spoke about a week before the election, and I gave you what I thought the numbers would be. Did anything surprise you, though?
I guess, unfortunately, I would say no, nothing really shocked me. I mean, hope and analysis are 2 different things. So, but it doesn't surprise me that Democrats did well and held suburban Wake County seats. And now, as I understand it, between Wake and Mecklenburg, there's one Republican in the House and Senate delegation. Yeah. So that reflected that where Democrats have strength. And then outside, it was disappointing that Democrats are playing such defense. But again, it's pretty obvious why we're playing defense, because again, our vote is so over-concentrated, and we don't have, cultures of support for Democratic candidates outside the cities, that we're looking at a tough situation legislatively because of gerrymandering. But even once you get beyond gerrymandering, there's still problems that we need to address. And unfortunately, now we'll get into the judicial races, it looks like the Republicans are back in control of a gerrymandering machine that we're going to have to get used to. So instead of thinking that's any kind of deliverance, we're really going to have to concentrate on creating cultures of support for candidates outside the urban counties.
Thank you, Mac. And for the next question, I want to go over to Anderson. Now that we've kind of seen how the election... Okay.
You gotta
So
project, Justin.
I'm going to speak up. So now we've talked sort of about the results. I want to go back to Anderson on this. She's plugged in with the local party, talks to a lot of people. Kind of, what's the vibe? About this election? Like, how do people feel amongst Democrats? Are they okay with it? We averted total disaster with we were able to hold the veto somewhat, so to speak. But what's the vibe amongst the party base, the people the people who are going to get out and do the work? How do they feel about this election?
Yeah, I think listening to Attorney Holmes and I up here, you can kind of see the dynamic of it. Kind of depending on where you were in the state that night on Tuesday to some degree. Just to be quite honest, I'm sitting there and I'm like, I am yes Wake County, yes Mecklenburg, but I'm also like, ooh. 98 other 98 other counties here that also had some really hard times in them, honestly. And I think that amongst a lot of the county chairs that I've talked to were disappointed, to say the least, and I think they felt a little frustrated and left behind by a party apparatus, by honestly even candidates this cycle, right, too. And I think that candidates felt left behind, honestly, this cycle, especially in areas that we knew were not going to be winnable, but we still should be fighting out there anyway, because any ground that we are ceding to a party right now that has fully endorsed white supremacy in our state is something that we're doing wrong as a party, in my opinion. And so I'm kind of like, we need to be fighting for every single one of those seats and helping those candidates wherever we can. And I think a lot of the reliance became on county parties to do some of that job and to pick that up. And I'll be honest with y'all, a lot of county parties were not prepared to do that, were not trained to do that, and didn't have the resources and the help and to be able to do that, to support those candidates. And so I feel for it on all ends of the spectrum, but I'm like, if we're going to keep expecting county parties to pick up where infrastructure is not already, to pick up that slack, honestly, in some degree, and expect them to be these machines in these counties that can do this work, that can do it effectively, that can help candidates, that can fundraise for them, that can put on events for them, that can be their campaign committees, that can be their treasurers, and I'm telling y'all this because I just did this for 3 different campaigns this past cycle, at the local level, because we had no other help to do that with. It was us, the machine that we had in Person County, and I say that because not a lot of other counties have something like this right now. There are so many county parties that are doing really great work, but there are a lot of them. We have 100, right? Give or take. There are a few that are still getting started and evolving themselves. But out of that, I think that you've got around 50 of them that are rebuilding and trying to figure this out and want to have a grassroots model, that want to get in their communities and do this. And the other 50 are kind of like, we don't really know what to do yet. And so I think that we are in a really hyper rebuilding stage, and Mac has hit on it a lot, but infrastructure, rebuilding that infrastructure everywhere that we possibly can, making sure that the Democratic message is getting out into communities, and also that those messages from those local communities are being filtered up. I think one of the most disappointing things that we didn't do this cycle is talk about issues and statewide for our state and House and Senate candidates, but talking about issues like broadband. Rural people are pissed about broadband right now. And I don't know what it's going to take for me to get a candidate that's going to, a Democratic candidate, honestly, to get up there and say, I want to repeal the state ban against municipality-owned broadband. I want to give that resource back and that power, right, back to our local communities, because our state government right now, our Republican legislature, is restricting our power as people at the local level. So where is that message amongst any of the candidates that ran this cycle? I want to hear it. I want us to talk about honestly taking on monopolies in this state. I want to hear candidates talk about the issues that really matter, and that I think matter to voters on the ground, honestly, that matter to rural voters. Like, I had a bunch of people talk to me this year, and they were like, Anderson, I'm a socialist in a rural community. Like, how do I talk about that? And I said, lose the word socialism, honestly. Like, to be real with y'all, I think that there are ways to approach clean water, which is part of the Green New Deal, and making these issues that are more localized and talking about them at that level, but having that come all the way up. And I think it comes from, and it's like Sean right here in our presence, also having people that at the local level are being able to have that. But I just think, like, I got 3 Democrats elected in Roxborough last year. They have no connection to any part of the state apparatus right now of the Democratic Party, and that shouldn't happen. Any elected official that we have in any part of this state should know who our state party is in that sense, and know who the players are and everything else. And I just think that's so important for us to be able to do that everywhere. So sorry to get on that tangent, y'all, but I'm hoping that kind of gives the reality there, Justin.
Thank you, Anderson, because we are obviously in touch as an organization with a lot of people around the state. People in the rural areas are glad they got to see some candidates this time they didn't get to see before. Now the people in the urban counties are mad because they didn't see those candidates. So it's like everyone's like, well, go run in the rural areas and try to get your numbers there. And then, unfortunately, you can't be everywhere. And then now the Mecklenburgs are mad with us. So it's like there's no perfect way to – if I could figure out a way to run a perfect race, I would let you know. But I haven't come up with it yet. It doesn't exist. But there's ways to go about it, I think, maybe where we approached it.
And that's my point. Like, we're acting like there's not a way to walk and chew gum at the same time, and there is a way to be active in all 100 counties in this state. Like, that should be North Carolina, in a state that's got 51% of its population still exists in a rural area. Like, we have got a lot of areas that, and Person County being one of them, as Mac has said, like our countrypolitan communities, right, that have larger populations of rural folks, more compact. And I think that, not a ton of other states across the country have that, and I think that North Carolina is rare because of that. But when you say you're going to forget rural North Carolina in any part of campaigning statewide, you're going to lose, I think.
Party leadership.
Blair's going to do not endorsed by Carolina Ford. We don't want to get in any trouble. So we've talked about what happened. Unfortunately, there is a consequence to losing races. One of the major ones I don't think that's really set in with Democrats just yet is we got clobbered in these judicial races, state Supreme Court level, appeals court. We had great candidates. Look, it's just a really bad cycle. I mean, we're asking them to do things that no one really could have done. But unfortunately, there's going to be a price that we have to pay for that. So I have my 2 lawyers up here with me, and I'm going to ask them, like, what kind of things are coming? Because we have no chance of really taking back the state Supreme Court until 2028 at this point. So I wanted to talk with Mac and Jessica about what kind of things are we likely to see out of these essentially activist courts, so to speak. I think that's really what they are. They're partisan courts now. So Mac, I'm going to go with you first.
Yeah, I'll speak as a lawyer, professor, and maybe just concerned about democracy here, not so much about Democrats. And when it comes to judicial races, I don't know if we could have ever changed. I have a lot of regrets about things we didn't do when I was around power in this state. And I don't know that we could have ever you can ever convince people not to have elections. But I'm clearly thinking that judicial elections are something that are, it's out, the genie's out of the bottle. We're not going to be able to correct it. But I'm very pessimistic. I went to a debate with the judicial candidates at Duke Law School when everyone was very proper and handled themselves very nicely. Had nothing to do with the campaign that's going on. And I think we should all be scared when judges have become regular, routine political actors. So when there's a good year, a Democratic year, which I'm hopeful that we'll have, we might win some judicial races. Democrats may win some judicial races. Doesn't look that well going forward. My concern is that who wins judicial races has absolutely nothing, almost nothing to do with the quality of that candidate anymore. And I would rather that if there was a Republican governor, that the Republican governor would absorb the appointments and have to explain what's going on with the judicial races. I felt like that Sherry Beasley was in a position where she's a judge, she's looking at the law, she has to make certain decisions that cannot be explained in a 30-second ad. And so I think she was a victim of this too. Unfortunately, maybe Victoria will have some answers because the cat's out of the bag. We probably are not going to be able in this state to go away from judicial elections, but I'm very pessimistic about them and about the democratic nature because I don't think people, the vote in the judicial races was almost exactly the same as the Beasley-Budd race. People they didn't know Sam Ervin was running. Maybe I did because I was old enough, and whether that mattered. They didn't know whether Lucy Inman was really running. They were voting generic R&D. Unless somebody stands out as a crazy person like perhaps Hines did and Sandy Smith in the congressional district and won. So I'm very pessimistic about judicial races, and I think we just have to wait for good Democratic years. But maybe we could change things. I don't know.
Jessica, you want to tackle that one as well?
Every election cycle, there's usually one race that at the end of the night makes me crawl into a ball and cry. And in 2024, this year, there were a lot of races I was disappointed about, but the one that made me get into a ball and cry was the fact that we lost our Chief Justice in 2020, and we lost the majority on the Supreme Court in 2022. And we lost every seat that was competitive on the Court of Appeals. We know in North Carolina that our governor does not have the ability to veto redistricting maps. So our system of checks and balances, as it relates to redistricting and gerrymandering, hinges upon the Supreme Court. And we know what the U.S. Supreme Court looks like, so that's not going to help us out at all. So there are three cases in particular that are of particular concern to me. As an education advocate, the Leandro decision, which has been ongoing for many, many, many years and involves funding for our public school system. The next case that causes me concern, I mentioned redistricting. Look out for the U.S. Supreme Court and the Moore v. Harper case. But a lesser known, talked about case involves the 56,000 individuals who were formerly incarcerated who were able to vote in the 2022 election. That case has been appealed, and now that case will be appealed to individuals that are much less friendly to the cause of these formerly incarcerated individuals having the right to vote after they have served their time. And those are just three of the things that I want you all to look out for. But quite frankly, I think it's going to be one hell of a ride for the next couple of years as it relates to almost the unchecked power of our General Assembly. We only held on to a veto-proof majority for Cooper's veto by one vote in the House. And we essentially have a Republican Court of Appeals, a Republican Supreme Court, and a Republican United States Supreme Court. And so I just think when it comes to things that are scary, on or around Halloween, folks were asking me, like, what are you going to dress as? Or, like, what do you think is scary? And I was like, North Carolina, if we lose these judicial races. And that's exactly what we did.
Yeah, I think that given how Victoria's laid it out, Jessica, that what we've got is a situation, it underlines even more why we have to have more of a grassroots strategy, an all-state strategy, because the judicial strategy for Leandro, no one knows what's exactly going to happen with Leandro, but we're not going to get judicial victories for the foreseeable future. That's just not going to happen. So that's, I think, it emphasizes again to Democrats that they need to rethink certain things, and I think kind of Leandro's strategies are off the board for better or ill.
Thank you, Mac. And so Jessica brought it up, redistricting. So I actually have a expert here on partisan gerrymandering, who was an expert witness during the last show trial we had on gerrymandering. So, Dr. Cooper, fallout from the court, what do you expect in terms of congressional pairings or number of seats, how this is going to happen, and do you think they're going to try and redraw the state legislative maps?
I don't know. I try to not sort of put my mind into what somebody's intent is or what they're going to do in the future. I mean, I'm reading the same tea leaves y'all are. I'm, reading what Lars and Don are writing about, and, that's where I'm getting my information here. My gut is, of course they're going to redraw the congressional lines. We know that. I think the outcome of this conversation depends on the outcome of Moore v. Harper. And not just, and we got two lawyers down here who should check me, but my take on Moore v. Harper is just like we shouldn't overread election wins and losses without paying attention to the details, that there are a lot of different ways this Moore v. Harper case could come down if they side with the Moore side that could mean very, very different things, not just for our state and for the country. So, of course, pay attention to which side wins, but I think how narrowly they decide that case, if it is on the Moore side, is going to be critical to figuring out what the General Assembly can and cannot do. I mean, I'm hearing the same thing y'all are hearing, that redrawing legislative lines is at least something that some folks in the General Assembly want to do. I have no special knowledge on that. In terms of who gets, double bunked, I mean, it seems pretty clear that at least in the past, double bunking Kathy Manning has seemed like a very good idea to the General Assembly. I doubt that's changed. I think what Dallas Woodhouse tweeted the second the new maps came out, that Jeff Jackson shouldn't get used to his seat. So clearly we should pay attention to that seat as well. The Hines-Nickel is obviously a really, yes, Wiley Nickel did much better, I think, than a lot of folks expected. But that's still a seat that could be redrawn pretty quickly to look very, very different. So those would be the ones that I'm eyeballing in terms of what the number they're going for. I don't know. I guess the only thing I'd really add is I'm seeing a little bit of this conversation percolate where people are saying, well, gerrymander didn't matter, and the reason we know is that the Republicans did well with court-drawn maps, well, with second round maps anyway, drawn by the General Assembly. But I mean, clearly, if the lines didn't matter, then why would we be having a conversation about redrawing them? Clearly, the lines do matter. Look at our congressional delegation, 7-7. Very, very clearly, this stuff does matter. So I don't know what they'll decide to do. I would just push back a little bit gently and hopefully kindly on the notion that it doesn't matter, because it most definitely does.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Absolutely it matters, because just like I talked about that House race in Mecklenburg, we lost by 660 votes. Ted Budd got 32% of the vote in Mecklenburg County, yet they were still able to win a state House race. Like in the county pairing that my county and Harnett County they put us in, do you think we got a competitive House race and we were getting 38 to 40% of the vote every time? No. So absolutely those lines matter. I had a whole bunch of other questions. We got to speed it up. I'm going to ask lightning round here, get everyone's opinion. We seem to be a bubble state in terms of being competitive. I was listening to David Plouffe's podcast, who was Obama's former campaign manager. He listed off 6 battleground states for 24. We were like number 7. Do we think that North Carolina is going to be an actual battleground, or is it we're just going to kind of be like the bubble state again? So, Mac, what do you say?
I think it'll depend on the national atmosphere. So much of North Carolina politics comes down to how things are going nationally. If it's a good Democratic year, I think you would consider us certainly a battleground, maybe even a pickup state. But maybe I guess that's right that we're not in the first tier. But I like Chris's formulation that people need to remember, which is in 2020, North Carolina was the bluest of the red states. In Georgia was North Carolina was the reddest of the blue states. Yeah. And so we're still on the cusp. That's the problem. And I would not suggest that we've fallen out of competition. Where we've fallen out of competition, unfortunately, is look at the rest of the South and look at what's happened in Florida. That's a real concern. North Carolina, I think Democrats still have the ability to compete and to win, but a lot more thought needs to be brought to that issue.
Jessica, you want to take a stab at that one?
I think he answered that very well. One thing I just wanted to know as a highlight of this election is the reality that apparently the road to D.C. runs through Jones Street. I want to talk a little bit about promotions. So we have 4 sitting senators that have been promoted out of the North Carolina Senate. So you have Valerie Foushee, you have Don Davis, you have Jeff Jackson, and you have Wiley Nickel. I also want to point out that for the first time in North Carolina's history, we are sending 3 African Americans to D.C. in Valerie Foushee, Don Davis, and Alma Adams.
Absolutely. We have an excellent bench of candidates, so I think there's a lot of sort of consternation about what happens when Cooper comes off the ballot. We've got some really good, we've got a solid bench, and at the national level as well. We've got some excellent governors. Like I'm not worried about us not being able to field competitive candidates. Dr. Cooper, Battleground, yes or no?
Yes, they've been calling us Battleground since 1980, and I think it's going to continue on, and that's for good reason.
Absolutely.
All right. Do you want to do audience questions? We're going to wrap it up. Okay, we've got chicken and looks like chicken sandwiches or biscuits over here, so we're done. Thank you guys.